Over the years, that's all changed, and banks have said, you know, because everybody else has decided they want to intrude into our business, and that's right, a whole lot of folks now set themselves up in a lobby someplace and say, we are appearing to be a bank or want to behave like a bank. The banks say, if that's the case, then we want to get into their business. And so now we have the kind of initiative here in the Congress that says, let's forget the lessons of the past. Let's believe the 1920s didn't happen. Let's not worry about Glass-Steagall. In fact, let's repeal Glass-Steagall. Let's decide that we can merge once again or fuse together banking enterprises and more risky enterprises, and we can go down the road just happy as clams and everything will be just great. And of course it won't. I mentioned hedge funds. Talk about risk. How about derivatives? About 5 years ago, and incidentally, those who vote for this bill will remember this at some point in the future, when we have the next catastrophic event that goes with the risks and derivatives. Fortune magazine wrote an article, "The Risk That Won't Go Away." Financial derivatives are tightening their grip on the world economy and no one knows how to control them. Somewhere around 70 to 80 trillion dollars in derivatives. I wrote an article in 1994 for the Washington Monthly magazine, and derivatives at that point were $35 trillion. $35 trillion. And you know something? Today, in this country, banks are trading derivatives on their own proprietary accounts. They just as well put a roulette wheel in the lobby. They just as well call it a casino. Banks ought not be trading in derivatives on their proprietary accounts. I have an amendment to prohibit that. I don't suppose it would get more than a handful of votes, but I intend to offer it. Is it part of financial modernization to say that this sort of nonsense ought to stop? Banks ought not be able to trade derivatives on their own proprietary accounts because that is inherently gambling. It doesn't fit with what we know to be the fundamental nature of banking and the requirement of the perception of safety and soundness of these institutions. Does anybody here think this makes any sense, that we got banks involved in derivatives trading in their own proprietary accounts? Does anybody think it makes any sense to have hedge funds out there with liabilities of trillions of dollars, losing hundreds of billions of dollars, and then being bailed out by a Federal Reserve-led bailout because their failure would be so catastrophic to the rest of the market that we can't allow them to fail? So, as banks get bigger, of course, we also have another doctrine. The doctrine in banking at the Federal Reserve Board is called too big to fail. Remember that term, too big to fail. It means that at a certain level, banks get too big to fail. They cannot be allowed to fail because the consequence on the economy is catastrophic. And therefore, these banks are too big to fail. Virtually every single merger you hear about in the newspapers or read about in the newspapers these days means we simply have more banks that are too big to fail. That's no-fault capitalism. Too big to fail. Does anybody care about that? Does the Fed? Apparently not. Of course, the Fed has an inherent conflict of interest. Just inherent. And I think if the Congress were thinking very clearly about the Federal Reserve Board, they would decide immediately that the Federal Reserve Board is not the locus of supervision of banks. I mean, the Federal Reserve Board is in charge of monetary policy. It is fundamentally a conflict of interest to be listening to the Fed about what's good for banks when they're involved in running the monetary policy of this country. If the Federal Reserve Board were, in my judgment, doing what it ought to be doing, it would be leading the charge saying, we need to regulate hedge funds because banks are involved in substantial risk on these hedge funds. Apparently hedge funds have become too big to fail. Then there needs to be some regulation. The Fed, if it were thinking, would say we need to deal with derivatives. And the proprietary or the trading on proprietary accounts of banks and derivatives is absurd and ought not happen. Well, some will remember that in 1994, the collapse in the derivative area, you might remember the stories. Piper's managers' losses may total $700 million. Corporation after corporation had to write off huge losses because they were involved in the casino game on derivatives. Bankers Trust thrives pitching derivatives, but climate is shifting. Losses by clients like P&G may crimp plan to change. The point is, we've got massive amounts of risk in all of these areas. The bill brought to the floor today does nothing to address these risks, nothing at all, but goes ahead and creates new risks by saying we will fuse and merge the opportunities for inherently risky economic activity to be combined with banking, which requires the perception of safety and soundness. Now, we got all these folks here who know a lot more about this than I do, I must admit, who say, well, except we're creating firewalls. We've got subsidiaries, we've got affiliates, we've got firewalls, they've got everything except common sense. Everything except common sense, and everything apparently except a primer on history. I just wish before people would vote for this bill, they'd be forced to read just a bit of the financial history of this country to understand how consequential this decision is going to be. Now, I obviously am in a minority here. We've got people who've dressed in their best suits and they just think this is the greatest piece of legislation that has ever been given to Congress. And we've got choruses of folks standing outside this chamber who've spent their lifetimes working to get this done, to say, would you just forget all that nonsense back in the 1930s about bank failures and Glass-Steagall and the requirement to separate risk from banking enterprise. Just forget all that. God, time has moved on. Let's understand that. Change with the times. We got folks outside who've worked on this very hard and who very much want this to happen. And we've got a lot of folks in here who are very compliant to say, absolutely, let me be the lead singer. And here we are. We got this bill, which I'll bet 5, 10, 15 years from now, we'll be back thinking of this bill like we thought of the bill passed in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in which this Congress unhitched the savings and loans so that some sleepy little Texas institution can gather deposits from all around America and, like a giant rocket, become a huge enterprise. And guess what? With all the speculation and the S&Ls and brokered deposits and all the things that went with it that this Congress allowed, what did it cost the American taxpayer to bail out that bunch of failures? What did it cost? Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. I'll bet one day somebody's going to look back at this and they're going to say, how on earth could we have thought it made sense to allow the banking industry to concentrate through merger and acquisition to become bigger and bigger and bigger, far more firms in the category of too big to fail. How do we think that was going to help this country?